Good morning, everyone. Our first speaker today at this room will be Bruna Borges. If anyone has any clarifying questions during her speaking, please speak up. And at the end, anyway, is going to be left sometimes for discussion and more questions. So, Bruna, you can start your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Roberta. The paper that I will present today is co-authored with Professor Fernando Esteban. The main research question in our paper is if higher shares of male peers and professors improve male students' career outcomes. To answer this question, we use data from the University of São Paulo, combined with multiple data sources to obtain long-term outcomes. Our main identification strategy is to use the random assignment of students to sections to obtain exogenous variation in the share of male peers and professors. And our main result is that female students become more career-driven when they are exposed to a broader female representation. We see that higher shares of female peers increase labor force participation rates for women, and also that a higher female faculty share will increase the probability that a student will become a top manager after graduating. We try to analyze some mechanisms that could explain our results. We can rule out as explanations a student's performance during university, the gender of the bachelor fees advisor, course-taking behavior, and interest in graduate studies. But we do observe a higher early labor market attachment if the student is exposed to a higher share of male peers. I will explain better this later. So what motivates our research question is that although women have advanced a lot in labor market outcomes, they are still underrepresented in top earning occupation, the phenomenon known as glass ceiling. Some literature suggests that female role models could counteract the glass ceiling. So exposure to more successful women can improve female labor market outcomes. And we believe that this can be especially relevant in male-dominated fields such as economics. And also in economics specifically, there is literature that shows a hostile environment for women. So it might be especially important. And a paper by Paredes, Pazerman, and Pino also verifies that in economics, higher shares of male classmates and professors will lead to less gender-biased views among students. The contributions that we have to the literature, the first one is that we are able to look at long-term outcomes. I think that many papers from the literature focus on educational outcomes during the university, and we are able to look at a host of labor market outcomes up to 5 years after graduation. And also we are focusing on the economics major, while the literature usually focus on the STM fields. Finally, the way that USP assigns students to sections allow us to estimate causal impacts of both peers and professors. And different from many papers that can estimate causal impacts, but look at roommates, we are able to look at the effect of having a higher share of male classmates, which might be also interesting. And as we have a measure of students' previous ability, that is the admission scores, we are also able to see whether the gender composition of high achieving female classmates impact labor market outcomes. Just giving a little bit of the institutional background, the University of São Paulo is a large public university, and at the Department of Economics, we verify low shares of both students and professors. Just to give a comparison, here in Brazil, using census data, we have 40% of male students in economics, so our share is much lower, 23. We don't have census data for the share of male professors in economics, but our share is similar to the one found by Brazilian Economics Survey, so I think that we are close to the national average, the 18%. To enter at USP, to be admitted, students will have to take the admission exam, and they can choose between two alternate time slots, daytime or evening classes. And for each time slot, they will be split in two different sections. And the way that the university assigns students to sections is by alphabetical order. So, for example, if I am from the same cohort and the same period than you, then the way that the university will divide students is using the first letter of the student's name. So we have the first section that we have students with letters from A to L, and a second section that we have students from M to Z, for example. We argue that the way that USP assigns students to sections mimics the random assignment of students, and we empirically observe that initials in general do not correlate with students' characteristics. The main exception is gender. There are some letters, some initials that are more or less correlated with female or male names. We formally test for the randomization, comparing students from section 1 and 2, conditional on cohort and period fixed effects. And we see that in terms of admission scores, age, etc., there are no gender difference, no difference for students from section 1 and 2, but we do observe that in section 1, there is a lower share of female students, and Lepine and Steven use USP data and find the same pattern, and they find that this pattern relates to the population, as higher educated women in São Paulo are more concentrated in the second half of the alphabet, their names. So this assignment of students to section will be useful to determine in which course sections students will attend the compulsory courses. During the first semester, the enrollment is done by the university staff, is centralized, and students cannot choose professors or courses, and all courses are compulsory. But in the following semesters, students are not necessarily required to attend lectures in their assigned section. But as we can see in the table below, we have a high compliance rate. So in the first term, that is the first semester, almost all students attend course in their assigned sections, and then this percentage will decrease, but the overall compliance rate is above 85%. Our empirical strategy will to use this assignment from the first semester as our source of exogenous variation in the female representation. We used 3 different measures of female representation. The first one will be classmates, where we consider classmates students that in the first semester were assigned to the same section than you. So your classmate will be students from the same cohort, the same time slot, and that were assigned to the same course section, that will probably attend more compulsory courses with you. We also see the impact of high achieving female classmates, and we define a student as high achieving if she ranked amongst the top 25% at FUVEST, the admission exam. And we also look at impacts of having higher share of female faculty members. The labor market outcomes that we are going to analyze are labor force I will explain better later, but for most of these labor market outcomes, I will use data from the Brazilian formal labor market, HAIS. Our first measure will be participation rates at the labor force. We will consider that a student participates at the labor force if she's a formal worker or a firm partner. And we also analyze occupation and industry choice. So we see the probability of a student becoming an economist or working at industries that typically employs economists. So financial sector, consulting firms, research institutions, and the public sector. We will also analyze if female representation impacts career progression, and we will do so by using 2 dumb variables, one that indicates if the student was a top manager and the other that indicates if the student was a middle manager. And finally, we will look at impacts on hourly weights 1, 2, and 5 years after expected graduation. Here I present the empirical model to estimate the impact of female classmates. To estimate this model, we will use simple OLS regressions. Our outcome variable is at the individual level. We include a gender dummy to capture overall gender differences in outcome variables. The share of male classmates will give us the impacts of male peers that are common to both men and women. And our mean coefficient of interest is beta 3, that will give us the additional impact of having a higher share of male peers. We will control for cohort and period dummies, and for sections, students, and professors' characteristics. I think I won't detail all the variables that include here, but I think it's worth mentioning that I control for peers' averageability, for admission scores, and here in this specification, I control for the gender share of male professors. The standard errors, standard errors are classified at the class level, and we use the same model from equation 1 to estimate the impact of high-achieving female peers. We just replace the share of male peers by the share of high-achieving female peers. And we control for the share of male peers in this model. To estimate the impact of male professor, we use a different approach. We will use a instrumental variables framework where we use the share of male professors the student would have if she remained in the assigned section as an instrument for the action percentage of female instructors in compulsory courses. So we estimate that using two SLS estimators, and equations 2 and 3 represent as our first and second states. Actually, I will have two first stages, as we have both the share of male professor and the interaction with the gender dummy. But just for briefness, I present just one of them. As we would expect, as we have a high compliance rate, the first stage is really strong. And the second stage, the model is really similar to the one that I used to estimate peer effects. We control for a gender dummy to allow for gender gaps in labor market outcomes. The share of female professors, beta 2, will give us overall impact of having higher shares of female instructors, and our key explanatory variable will be the interaction term that will give us the additional effect for women of having a higher share of female instructors. The control variables will be the same, both in equation 2 and 3, will be the same that I just presented in the previous slide. So as an additional test of the validity of our empirical strategy, we use the students' characteristics as dependent variables, and we tested where they correlate with the share of male classmates and professors. And we see no correlation. The coefficients are not usually small, and they are not statistically significant. Okay, should I stop for questions? I don't know. Does anyone has any question? So
if anyone has a question, you can raise your hands or unmute yourself and speak up.
Okay, so I will go on. Thanks. So to answer these questions, we use data from the undergrad program in economics at the University of São Paulo. We have student, instructor, and course data. Our sample of students are students admitted between 2000 and 2008. To obtain instructors' characteristics, we collect data on LATS platform, and we also use the Qualis ranking to assess the quality of professors' publications. The labor market outcomes, almost all of them will come from HISE, the Brazilian formal labor market data, We use data from 2002 to 2017, but we will also complement this data with information on firm ownership that is provided by the Brazilian Revenue Service. We will also use data from the MPAC exam to obtain the probability of applying to a master in economics. Here I will present just summarize our results, and then I will focus on labor force participation and career progression that I think that are our most important results. But if I have time enough, I can discuss the other results better later. So we see that for women, higher shares of male classmates and high achieving female classmates improve labor force participation. We find little impacts on industry and occupation choice, but we see that a higher share of male professors increases the probability of women working at consulting firms. And we see also that the share of high achieving female classmates increases the likelihood of a female student becoming an economist. The share of male professors improves career progression by increasing the probability that a female student will be a top manager at the labor market. And finally, we analyze impact on hourly wages. We see that there is no differential impact for men and women of the share of male classmates, although the share of male peers increase wages 1, 2, and 5 years after graduation for both men and women. But we see that the share of male professors increases just for women wages 2 years after graduation. The coefficients for wages 1 and 5 years after graduating is not statistically significant, although it's positive. Here I will present the detailed impacts of male classmates on labor force participation. I won't present the impact of female professors because we find no impact, so just for briefness. In the first 4 columns, I will present participation rates at the formal labor market, and in the following columns, it's overall participation that considers both formal labor market and firm ownership. In panel E, we see the impact of the share of male classmates, and we observe that the share of male classmates for women increase labor force participation 2 and 5 years after expected graduation. If we have a 1 standard deviation higher share of male classmates, the probability of working 5 years after graduation will increase by 6 percentage points. In panel B, we do the same analysis, but focus on the gender composition of high achieving peers. And we see that at any moment that we analyze, focus in this row that shows the interaction term, there is a positive impact of having high achieving female peers for women. 5 years later, a 1 standard deviation higher share of high achieving female peers will lead to almost 5% higher participation at the labor force. We also found impact on career progression. So we see that for female classmates, there is no impact on women's career advancement, but we do observe that the share of male professor for women increases the probability of becoming a top manager at the formal labor market. The impact is quite sizable, as 10 percentage points higher share of male professors, that's 1 standard deviation, will lead to a 5 percentage points higher probability of becoming a top manager, which is quite sizable, as we have only 7% of students that become top managers. We then analyzed some potential mechanisms that could explain our results. So we see female representation impact a bunch of outcomes. The first one was students' performance during the undergrad program. We look at degree completion, GPA, and time to graduation, and we find no impact. We also tested if the share of male peers and professors impacted the gender of the bachelor fees advisor, and we also find no impact. Then we use impact data to see if female representation impact the probability of taking the impact exam, as it's a centralized exam that you use to almost all Brazilian master programs. I think that it's a good measure of willingness to pursue a master in economics. And also there is no influence of female representation on this outcome. Then we look at course taken behavior. At the University of São Paulo, almost 60% of credits are in compulsory courses, but the remaining 75% are in courses from the Department of Economics. And then we divided those economics courses in some research fields, microeconomics, macroeconomics, finance, and humanities, and we analyze if female peers or professors impact the number of courses in each field. And in general, there's little impact on course taken behavior. And then finally, we analyzed if the share of male professors and peers impact the probability that a student will work during the undergraduate studies. We measure work if the student was an intern, and we have internship data from the University of São Paulo, or if she worked as a regular work at the formal labor market using data from HISE. We saw that the share of male classmates increased the probability that a female student will work during the undergrad studies, and we interpret this impact as an early labor market attachment, so an early career-driven step. So just to conclude, in our paper, we estimated the impacts of both the share of male classmates and professors in economics on women's career outcomes. We find that a higher representation leads to women more career-driven. We see increases in labor force participation rates. We also observe an early labor market attachment, and we see that the share of male professors improve career progression. Our results are not driven by a better student's performance, the gender of the advisor, course taken behavior, or a higher or lower probability of taking the impact exam. We consider the possibility that there are other channels that were influenced and we do not observe. It's possible that male representation leads to higher levels of ambition or self-confidence among women, but we cannot observe. I think that's it. Thanks a lot.
If anyone has any comments or any questions, you can raise your hand. Gustavo?
Hi, Bruna. Excellent presentation. Thank you. Just a quick question on, did you check the maternity leave variable in RISE? Because one of the mechanisms could be the decision to give birth to a child.
Yes, I did check. But as I'm looking at outcomes only 5 years up to graduation, there's a low percentage of women that were on maternity leave.
Right. But then, but did you check the effect? Even in this first 5 years, there was no differential effect on this decision to give birth to a child.
I didn't check, but I can double check. But the reason was that it was really, really low, the percentage. But I will check it anyway.
And do you know if that's because the variable is measured with error? Because I never used that variable in RISE. Do you know if that's because the variable is measured with error, or because, you know, like the percentage of women in this first 5 years of life? Because it's strange, right? There should be a lot of women with having child in this.
Oh no, yeah. Actually, I think that I gave you the wrong answer. Just remembering, I think that the main reason that we don't look at the maternity leave variable, it's because we don't have men on maternity leave. But I think that we could definitely add some descriptive statistics to see if they can explain our result. I think that for women, it's 17%. It's not that low, the percentage.
But yeah, what I have in mind, sorry for taking so long, but what I had in mind is that, you know, the decision to have a child, so you only need women that were exposed to female professors, right? As the
yeah, I'm comparing men and women that were exposed. So, but I can, yeah, I can use a use a different approach, maybe.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Because I think that yes, this decision surely matters. Thanks for the question.
I have another question. So
yes,
I was just wondering, do you have an idea about the number of female professors that you had in USP around this period? Because I'm worried that what you're capturing in the share of female professors may be something that is more idiosyncratic about the specific female professors that you had at USP relative to a more question like having a female professor.
I think that probably between 30 and 40 female professors in our sample, because just quickly doing the maths. I control for other professors' characteristics, so maybe this could help for the average quality of the publication, average experience, and other characteristics. But yes, if we have like, if some female professors are really more likely to teach sections, we could have this problem.
Can I ask you something?
Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't raise my hand for some reason. Is there any impact on the likelihood of graduating in economics, or didn't you see major switching or anything like that?
As in Brazil, we choose the major before, like when you apply to the University of São Paulo, there's not much transfers, but we looked at degree completion, so to the probability of obtaining the bachelor degree in economics, and we find no difference. And
on that, can you extend to other majors your analysis, or you have to focus in economics for some reason?
I have this data on economics, so I cannot, but it would be interesting.
Yeah, I don't know, if you have general admission data, you could maybe expand, right, to engineering or to other majors that would be even more male dominated.
Yes, it would be interesting.
I make some questions here? Actually, I would like to hear you about the interpretation of these results. They are quite interesting. And one thing, why for some results the peer mates would be more important than the instructors? And the other question is out of your sample. Should we expect the same results for men in courses where the women are majority? And is there some study that look at for men and not female, and we would have the same effect?
I'm not aware of any study looking at female-dominated fields. Most of the students that I have read are on male-dominated fields, so I don't know the impact on men, but it might be interesting also. And about the interpretation, I think I interpret female professors more as role models and female peers more as like a better environment, but it's just an interpretation.
Thank you.
If anyone else has a question, you can raise your hands or speak up. Okay, then we'll move on to thanks, Bruna, for your presentation. We'll move on to Ursula. If anyone has any clarifying questions during her presentation, you can raise your hand or speak up. But at the end, she will have some time to discuss and comment on her results. You can go on.
Yeah, let me just put in full screen. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to present my work in this first session. And this work builds up on research and affirmative action that I have been conducting since my PhD. And I have a first paper in which I analyze how the Quota Law, the federal affirmative action law for undergraduate education in Brazil, affected enrollment of students in the federal higher education system. And now in the second paper that I'm presenting today, I move on to analyze how this law impacted dimensions of students' behavior before college, especially students' choice for school, and I'm gonna tell you why. So the Quota Law was implemented in 2012 by the federal government and established that 50% of all vacancies in each major and in each federal higher education institution has to be reserved to individuals that attended all 3 years of high school in a public school. So unintendedly, the government creates incentives for public school attendance. And there has been this anecdotal discussion between policymakers that what happens? Like, do students move to public, the rich private school students move to public schools in order to benefit from this law? Is this happening? Are the students then that are benefiting from the law the rich students that then move strategically? So motivated by this, I went on to try to understand what is indeed happening. So the objective of this paper is first to understand whether QL increases moves from private to public schools, and whether these results are heterogeneous depending on ethnicity and the type of school of origin. And then understanding, well, this happens, yeah, a little spoiler of the results, yes, this is happening. And then if this happens, what are the some of the potential consequences of this move? So today I will talk about some potential costs for the switchers and adjustments in the high school system that follows this strategic move. In general, affirmative action policies have been implemented in higher education in different countries to mitigate inequality in access, in performance, in graduation. Those policies are particularly important in countries like Brazil that have a legacy of institutions rooted in socioeconomic and racial inequality. And they are also very common, for example, in India, in the US, in South Africa, and now affirmative action with a social criteria rather than racial criteria are becoming common even in countries in Europe, such as France, and also like Chile, Israel. It's becoming more spread. There is a large and growing literature in economics that investigates how AA impacts students' behavior and outcomes during college, but most of this literature is still focused in the US experience. But a lot less is known about how such policies impact students' behavior before college. And one of the reasons is that there are some identification challenges in nailing down how policies that are happening in higher education impact students before college. But the literature is moving towards this look, and because it is important to understand how these policies impact the students' behavior in their whole trajectory to understand their overall impact. And I think that this paper contributes to like broader to the economics of education literature, not only to the affirmative action literature, because in many contexts where there is no affirmative action, students are still graded on a curve. So they are graded relatively to their peers or relatively to their schools. So in many contexts where there is no affirmative action, where it's not even legally feasible, for example, here in Spain, students are still graded in their specific school, in their ranking. So there is opportunity for strategic school choice. So I think this paper will contribute to this literature that evaluates, that designs policies in which students are graded relatively to their specific group, and thus would have some incentive for strategic choice. Affirmative action in Brazil, it started as early as the 2000s and started specifically in 2023. And before 2013, they were a choice of specific institutions. They were growing this decade until August of 2012, when the Congress passed the Quota Law that, as I said before, established that 50% of vacancies in all majors have to be reserved to students that attended the 3 years of high school in a public school. And this was kind of unexpected. This law was floating around the Congress for a while, but the timing of approval was quite unexpected because most of the federal institutions had already launched their documents for admission of that year. Most of them had to retract and redo it to incorporate this federal law. And so I think we can think that more or less timing was exogenous in some sense. And also important, a percentage of these vacancies has also to be reserved to non-white and low-income students. And this graph just plots, is just to give an idea how institutions were distributed before the federal law in terms of their admission policy related to quotas for public school students. So each circle is one federal institution. And as you can see, many institutions already had 50% of quotas for public school students, but a lot of institutions had 0 quotas for public school students. Some institutions had something in between. So the average level of quotas in the federal system was around 21%, but there was a lot of heterogeneity. And this graph plots the share of public school students in each major of federal higher education institutions in 2012, which is the blue line, and in 2016, which is the red line. So the blue line is before the law. So many programs, many degrees already had more than 50% of public school students, but a lot of them had much less. And then with the law, it's just to have an idea that the law changes things, like things change in higher education in Brazil with this law. Though the distribution moves to the right, and I mean, it becomes, this law changes the structure and then impacts incentives. Now moving to what I actually do to identify this effect, I use the Census of Basic Education, which is the administrative data containing information of the universe of students enrolled in education in Brazil. So I select students enrolled in 9th grade between years T equal 28 to 2015, so some years before the law and some years after. I focus on students in 9th grade because that's the transition that needs to be made in order for a student to benefit from the law. So I will analyze exactly the transition between 9th grade and 1st grade of high school. I use individual ID, and then I link students, the individual student information between one year to the next. So I can identify precisely students that moved schools in this transition, and precisely if they moved from the private to the public system. And then I directly observe how each institution, each of the 107 federal institutions in Brazil is exposed to QL. So I use the share of quotas that for public school students that institutions had before the law. So I create this variable treat for university or institution U and microregion M. So this Q is exactly this percentage of quotas for public school students in 2012 before the law. So for institutions that already had 50%, 0.5, this will be 0. And the treatment will be 0. And for institutions that had 0, this treatment will be 1, but will allow for it to vary too between 0 and 1. So I observe how each institution is treated, each higher education institution is treated. But what I want to do is understand how a student in 9th grade is exposed to treatment in higher education. So institutions in 9th grade are not assigned to any higher education institution. So I need to construct a measure of exposure of these students that are 14 years old. So first thing that I do is that I focus my analysis on the 50 micro-regions of Brazil where there is one federal university. And the reason I do that is because higher education attendance in Brazil is very localized. So 86% of undergraduate enrollees attend higher education in the same municipality where they actually lived before at age 14. According to the census of 2010. So location of residence is a very important determinant of where you're going to attend higher education. So when I focus on these 50 microregions, anyway, I have 45% of the population of students. And then I create this measure of exposure for microregion M by aggregating the treatment of all institutions of that microregion with attributing as a weight the size of each institution. And so this treat one measure at microregion M just assumes that students in 9th grade are exposed to treatment of the institutions of the same microregion where they reside. So I started like this, but then as a second measure, I try to include some flexibility, and I construct then this treat 2M measure, which I use flows from a previous year from the census. And the way it works is just I go to the population census of 2010, and I observe this theta M, which is the percentage of students that lived in microregion M before college and during college. But I also observe the flows, the other flows, the theta Rs, which is the percentage of students that live in microregion M, but that move to other microregion R for college. So in the end, I construct a measure of, I use a measure of exposure in which students in 9th grade can be exposed to treatment in any microregion in Brazil. But in the end, since this theta M, since higher education is very localized, the measures are very similar, and then, but I run my results with both, but I'm going to present just they are very similar because the measures are very similar anyway. And this is just a figure of this 50 microregions. So I use students of in 9th grade of these regions, these 50 microregions, which includes all state capitals, all the largest metropolitan areas in Brazil. And there is substantial variation, which is important for identification. So I use as what I'm going to present here is mostly the results from an event study specification, in which Y is the outcome of student I, of microregion M, of school S and time T. So in the main result, for example, Y would be, so I will estimate this separately for students from private or public schools. So take students studying in 9th grade in private schools. So Y will be 1 if the student moves to a public school for high school, and it's 0 otherwise. So the treatment defined at microregion M is the variable that I just defined for you, which defines how individual I is exposed to the QL reform depending on the microregion of residence in 9th grade. I have a vector of individual controls, of time-varying microregion or municipality controls. And importantly, I have school fixed effects, which absorb microregion fixed effects, and I have time fixed effects. And then my betas 2012 to 2015 will measure the effect of QL on the effect of QL on my outcome of interest. And the main identifying assumption is that dynamics in the outcome for treated and control would have been parallel in absence of treatment. And importantly, as I said, I have school fixed effects that will absorb any time invariant characteristic at the school and the local level. So in the end, my variation, my identification comes from within school variation. So I'm comparing students of cohorts of students of the same school that were exposed or not exposed to the quota law, depending on timing that they were in 9th grade. And a threat would be any unobservable time varying characteristics correlated to outcome. And this graph portrays my main results. So the blue line plots movements from private to public schools. And as you can see, the coefficients for the pre-periods 28 to 2010 are close to 0 in magnitude and insignificant. But then, so 2011 is the baseline year. And 2012 is exactly the first cohort that I expect to be affected, because so those are the students that were in 9th grade in 2012. So they were exposed to the law in August, and then they have a few months to then decide if they're moving schools. So I expect actually these effects to be lower than in the following years. And then I also expect some dynamics. But then I observed that the introduction of the quota law increases movements from private to public schools by around 16% in 2012, and then 28% in 2013. So it's a sizable effect that increases. And in the red line, I plot movements from public to private schools. And there is no effect on these movements. And also because they were very low to begin with, only around 2% of students would, in the baseline, move from public to private schools in this transition. And then I plot some heterogeneity by ethnicity. So results are stronger for non-whites, and which is also expected because there are some specific sizable quotas for non-whites in the quota law. So it's around 7 percentage points for non-whites and 3 percentage points for whites. And I'm just gonna guide you very briefly to these, but this is some heterogeneity. So here I aggregate the before years with the post years, because now I start doing some heterogeneity and I don't have information for all schools in some of these variables. But the essence of this is that the results, the effect, come from schools that are in the bottom, the students don't come from the top schools, the richest schools of the country. They come from the low SES schools. The effects are higher for schools with low probability, predicted probability of future federal higher education attendance. In panel C, I do heterogeneity by the grade, the school grade at the name. So it comes also results larger for low performing schools. And then in panel D, I do some heterogeneity by the school segregation level of the microregion. So interestingly, the effect comes from microregions that are below the median of school segregation. Okay. So from the low, when there is low segregation, there is more possibility of moving. From the highly segregated areas, there is no movement. And I don't have much time, but this is, then I augment the model. You might say, well, but there might still be some time varying confounders at the microregion level that might be affecting my results. So then I use a triple differences in differences. Then in addition of comparing treated and controls before and after, I now compare students that are moving from the 9th grade to high school, which can strategize, with students that move from first year of high school to the second year of high school. These students, even if they move schools, they cannot benefit from the quota law because they need to attend all high school in those schools. So I include this triple interaction in order to provide some robustness evidence, but my results, they remain robust. They are a little lower in magnitude in years 2013 and 2014, but the pattern of the result remains sizable. And then I just wanted to talk about some potential consequences. So students move schools, and this result is robust to many things, which I cannot show for the sake of time. But then these students are coming from the worst private schools. They are coming exactly from the part of the distribution where I expect them to come anyway. But are they moving to public schools that are similar to the private schools that they were attending, or are they actually trading down? Are they moving to worse schools? So now I use as the outcome of the school of destiny of the student. It's an outcome computed in 3 periods. And I do this in a reduced form framework, but also in an IV framework in which I instrument this variable for moving schools with the treatment, with the reform. And this is just me guiding you. I know there's not enough time to completely understand everything, but what I show here in this second, so the first column is just the first stage, the second column is the reduced form. So what I say is that students, private school students in 9th grade that are exposed to this reform, they end up attending schools. There are high schools, there are poorer and there are worse in performance. And then when I use the instrumental variable approach, I know the effect on compliers. So moving to a public school induced by QL, by the quota law, decreases the movers' schools by the mover school socioeconomic status by 1.1 standard deviation, which is this coefficient, and the school's performance by 0.74 standard deviation. So students are trading down. So it looks like that knowing the importance of school quality, it looks like they are moving towards schools. This is one thing. And the last thing that I wanted to show is the effects on this private school system. So I don't observe prices, but what I observe instead is that this strategic move, with this move, in panel A, I show the size of the grade of number of students in first grade of private high schools. So there is a decrease in size of the high schools in affected regions. And then I also observed that there is an increase in private school closure or inactivity due to this reform. So this looks like to be a reform that is indeed impacting the private high school system. And this is just for you to have an idea of the numbers. So on average, 10th grade has around 60 students. So with the QL reform, reduces the size of the first grade by 6 students, around 10%. And there is an increase in school closure, of probability of school closure, of 3 percentage points, which is also sizable. And I think I can conclude here so I can get 1 or 2 questions. Thank you.
If anyone has a question, can raise your hand. Okay, Bruno.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you for the presentation. I think those are very interesting results. One thing that I was wondering more in the empirical part is that most of the variation that you are exploiting comes from the fact that probably in other regions that experienced the protest before, they already experienced all of those effects. So I think it will be nice to strengthen the empirical evidence to try to back out and come back and see whether these places that already had quotas, they also found the same effects doing a similar definitive approach as you did in the main analysis. And actually, I generally don't find any evidence that there are pre-trends, but given if you had some places that started the quotas like in the period that you are analyzing in the pre-trends, then you could expect to find pre-trends, because then is to capture that if you're analyzing, for example, a place that had quotas in 2012, and you look at like their outcomes in 2008, which was before they had an effect, then you should expect some differences in these regions as well. So I think it would be nice to try to collect this information when the quotas before the national reform started, and try to do the differences using all of those variations.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. I completely agree. I do observe information since 2010, so I could back out some of these. Yes. What I just think that like this is not systematic, but yes, I think you are right that I can do that. Yes, thank you.
Moving to Gustavo.
Hi, Ursula. Very interesting presentation. Thanks a lot. I have 2 comments. One is a very quick one on micro-regions with state universities. Did you control for that at some point? Because these state universities could have some affirmative action policies as well. But the other question I think could be more interesting is there's another effect, which is public high schools could be getting better, right? So these students that are moving from private high schools, they are probably better than the average of students in public high schools, because they have a higher chance of going to a university. So somehow that could be like an effect over time of improving public high schools. So I don't know if that takes too long, but if you get better students in high school, in public high schools, at some point these public high schools can improve. So that was a general thought. Thanks.
Thank you, Gustavo. Yes, about the state school, the state universities, I think they are more important in São Paulo, like than in other states, specifically in other microregions, but I haven't done anything specifically yet, but I have data on state schools too, so I could do that to
Just a
check.
quick thing, because UERJ also had this quota. Well, Bruno had.
Yeah, it was before. UERJ
Right.
was like 23, was one of the first ones. Yeah. And about the schools, that's definitely something that is very interesting. And I have some evidence that general scores of schools increase, but what I cannot do, I haven't found a way to do, is to actually separate what is the effect of the students switching and what is the effect on the quota law on effort itself. Because the students that were already in public schools, they maybe have more incentives to study more in some sense. So I see an overall effect, but I cannot distinguish what are the switchers and what are the ones that were already there. So I haven't included that in this paper yet, but I have some evidence that this happens. And
It's probably a different paper. It would be a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Just one thing I think is not very clear, but going this direction, maybe you can try to look at the effort effects on some cohorts that weren't able to change. For example, the guys who are already in the third grade, and then you try to back out. I mean, it's not very clear, but you could separate the effect of effort and the effect of these peer effects from getting better peers.
Yeah, that's very good. You have a paper on that, right? On human capital. And yeah, it's on the to-do list, but yeah, I'm trying to get some extra data with the INEP, the Sala Segura, in order to be able to really control for pre-human capital ability and things like that. Yeah, this cannot be done, I think, with the public data, but I think it's interesting, yes.
Okay, moving on to Beatriz.
Hi, first of all, congratulations on your presentation. I wanted to know if you consider federal institutes in your analysis, because I think there may be something related to students moving from private schools to public schools, the federal institutes, but not exactly because of the quotas, but related to the quality of school or something like this.
I didn't get the first part of the question. I think there was a bit of...
I wanted to know if you consider the federal institutes in your analysis, because I think there may be something related to this, but not exactly related to the quotas, but related to the quality of schools. Because some of the students may be in public schools with a low quality, but want to move to another public school that is a little better in the education. I wanted to know if you consider this.
They are in the analysis, yes, but they are, I think, just 2% of enrollments. I'm not really sure now, but I mean, I think that indeed they could even be moving to these institutes, but importantly, there are federal institutes across all Brazilian microregions, and this effect really comes from the microregions that are then affected by the federal law. But I mean, I can always drop students that move to these institutes. I could do something specific about it. Yes, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, moving on to the last question of Henrique.
Hi, Ursula. I have a question with regards to, I think that it's with regards to data, because one thing that you may be interested in is about the possibility of trying to know if students, in fact, are getting into universities. So they may be going to worse schools, but they are, in any case, because of the quotas, they are going to universities. So that's better for them, a better deal for them. So can you see that, or you don't have the data for that?
Yes, I cannot see that with the public data, but I have done some analysis with the restricted data. And what I observe, I didn't, for the sake of time, I didn't include here. I think it's, I observed that interestingly, like the quota law itself before strategic school choice already increases substantially the enrollment of students that attended public school, attended high school in a public school, but 9th grade in a private school. So even the adoption of the law without strategic school choice already increases this likelihood of richer students in some sense attending federal higher education, I think from 12% to 26%. But then when I allow for a school choice, that when I compare with the cohort that can switch schools, this effect increases about 5 percentage points. So yes, I can observe this with the restricted data, and there is an effect, but the biggest part of the effect actually comes before even there is the possibility of school choice switching. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ursula, for your great presentation. And now we're going to move on to the last presentation of our room. It's my presentation. Just share my screen. Again, if anyone has any clarifying questions, you can raise your hands, and at the end we will let some time to comments and questions as well. So today I'm going to talk about internal migration in Brazil due to economic shocks. My case of study will be actually drought shocks and the internal migration that comes from semi-arid Brazil. So the first question is why people migrate? Now, why people leave their homes, their houses? And the first answer is that people migrate because they expect higher returns elsewhere vis-a-vis their current location. But also, if you think that the reality of some people is that they are very poor, so they are credit constrained, they are liquidity constrained. So we can also think as migration as a way to cope with local adverse shocks. And a type of shock that has been gaining academic attention is natural disaster, is climate-related shocks. Due to climate change and environmental discussion, people also even raise questions about in the future we can have a situation of significant environmental refugee. In leading this discussion, here in our paper, we are going to question two things. Firstly, we're going to question if the case of Brazil can answer us that we can find evidence with Brazil that people do migrate because of local adverse shocks. And secondly, and most importantly, is the main contribution of our paper, is under what local conditions of municipalities this out-migration response can be less or more pronounced. So as I said, our case of study will be internal migration that comes only from semi-arid Brazil, driven by drought shocks. And we are also going to try to find some mechanisms behind this out-migration response. Why semi-arid Brazil is appropriate setting for our study? Firstly, is the poorest region of the country. So as I said before, if you're thinking about a situation where we have some lack of resources, where person have some credit and liquidity constraint, is an appropriate setting. Also, we know that it's a region that is vulnerable to water scarcity. And there are also other papers showing that the drought shocks really affect the lives of the semi-arid people. It also is the most populous semi-arid region of the world, so we have some population data and observations. And we know from anecdotes that this region is historically associated with large flows of internal migration from semi-arid to other parts of Brazil. So here we are going to focus actually on our data comes from since the 70s until 2010. So we are going to use census data and construct retrospectively a municipality year panel. The first observation will be at the 70s. Since we are studying the 70s, we have to use the limits of the municipality from the 70s, which restricts our sample for semi-arid Brazil to 900 municipalities, but it's still a high number for a cross-section variation. And mainly this paper can be divided in two parts. The first part is to look at the drought shocks and try to answer first if we do have impact in local economy. So my first analysis will see the impact of drought shocks to the agricultural production of these local municipalities. And afterwards, in this first part, I will try to see if the Brazil case gives us evidence that these drought shocks that we know that affected the economies is leading to out-migration response. And we also do some analysis on heterogeneity. And the second part of our paper, and is the most important part, is to try to exploit some municipality heterogenealities to see some mechanisms that could influence this out-migration response. So here I'm going to show two mechanisms. The first one is the rural social security benefit. That's a benefit that exists since the 70s, but was expanded greatly in the 90s. And this paper of Juliano, for example, already showed that had a significant impact on reducing rural poverty in Brazil. And also this second paper from IPEA showing that half of what the federal government pays from rural social security actually goes to the Northeast. So it's a relevant transfer to this region. And the second heterogeneity that I'm going to look is to try to have a measure of credit availability. So I will use from official data of the Brazilian Central Bank, the number of bank branches by municipality per capita. So the literature that my paper is related to has been showing that weather variability, climate shocks affects the economy, especially when we think of agricultural output. Knowing that this shock is relevant, there is some discussions about if this negative risk, if this adverse shocks this risk is more pervasive to credit constrained households. If people that come from poorer places that don't have credit, don't have liquidity to cope with shocks are more affected to these local adverse shocks. Given this scenario, migration is studied as a coping strategy after these local adverse shocks. However, when we look at developing countries, actually the literature found some mixed results of this out-migration response after these local adverse shocks. So we have some results of positive impacts on migration, but if you think that migration is a process that is costly and is selective, we can have some results of ambiguous or actually negative impacts on migration after these negative shocks. So actually the response is not very clear. The literature now says that this motivation, this response, it's more complex than previously assumed. In the case of Brazil, this paper of 2013 uses a 10-year municipality panel with census data and found positive response of migration after droughts. Our gain in relation to this paper is that we have a municipality year panel, and furthermore, at least in my knowledge, I do not know of a previous study that tried to see the mechanism and what local condition of municipalities can influence and this out-migration response in the case of Brazil. So my data, I use census data to construct a municipality year panel. So and I use started with the census of 1980. So in those census, the interviewer asked the question of if the individual was born in the municipality that they're in now. If the question is negative, then it questions him which municipality he lived before and how many years he has lived in the current municipality. So given this response, we can construct retrospectively municipality year panel of migration. We have an issue is that in the census of 2000, the question was only asked for the previous 5 years. So actually, we have a gap in our panel that goes to 75, 91 to 96 and 2010. But anyway, here we are going to analyze our main variable is the migration rate from all these similarity Brazil municipalities. So we control for the population of those municipalities of origin. And how are we going to measure droughts? We use here ground weather station from IMET, that's the official Brazil Institute of Meteorology that have ground stations in Brazil since the 1960s. And our main measure of drought would be the Aridity Index. It's a more suitable index to try to measure water scarcity because not only accounts for precipitation, but only accounts to evaporation. It's mostly common to use only rainfall deviations, but we argue that evaporation can also bring information about humanity, so it can be more suitable to try to measure these drought shocks. And we're going to have 3 model specifications to try to measure these drought shocks. The first will be a dummy variable, and it's going to be consider a drought in the municipality in that year if the mean aridity index in that year was higher than 2. The second model specification, we will use the aridity index as a continuous variable. And the last specification will actually, we have 2 dummies and with intensity categories. And the first one would be consider a regular drought if the aridity index in the year was between 2 and 5, and an extreme drought event if the aridity index in the year was higher than 5. We are restricting our sample of out-migration to only semi-arid Brazil as classified by the government. It's mainly the Northeast with the exclusion of Zona da Mata and the inclusion of the north of Minas Gerais. Today corresponds to around 1,000 and 300 municipalities, but since we're again limiting to the 70s, that the number drops to around 900 municipalities, correspond mostly to the Northeast, and it's around 50% of the Brazilian population in our period of analysis. Our data comes, our municipality data comes mainly firstly agricultural production that comes from IBGE to see if the drought shocks has a negative impact on the economy, and then to try to measure rural social security, we're going to use the share of the individuals that are eligible to receive the rural social security based on IBGE population estimates. And lastly, for municipality heterogeneity, our variable will be the number of bank branches that comes from Brazilian Central Bank. And just quickly, descriptive stats table showing here that migration rate is around 1,000. In the 70s, it has decreased a little bit from now, but not very much. population has increased, and the rural proportion has decreased sharply. So it goes from 75 to a half, but this number is still higher when we compare to the rest of the country. Moving on, here, this is a map of semi-arid Brazil that shows a little bit of our cross-section and annual variation. So here in lighter yellow, it's a municipality in a year that has the aridity index less than 2, so no drought. And in orange, this municipality in this year had a regular drought that we call, so aridity index between 2 and 5. And the most red one, it has an extreme drought event. So we can see here that with some examples that we have an annual and also cross-section variation between the semi-arid Brazilian municipalities. Our methodology will be the two-way fixed effect model, and it's the most commonly used in this climate literature. Its main features, it has a fixed effect for municipality, so we control for time invariant municipality unobservables, and also to common trends throughout the semi-arid region. And again, our first question, we will use these three model specifications. Our first dependent variable will be agricultural production to see the effects of drought shocks in the economy. And the second will be to see the effect on the migration rate. And the second part of the paper, we will use an interaction with our variables that try to measure some local municipalities' conditions, and we interact them with the drought measure to see the sign of these coefficients to try to give us some answer if some local conditions can exacerbate or not the migration response to the drought shocks. And our results, firstly, we can see that the drought measure in all three model specification affects deeply the economy, and it has a profound negative impact on the local agriculture productivity. And our second table, so with this scenario corroborated that the drought shocks affect the economy, we can see in this second table that this adverse local shock has been linked to increase in migration. So the Brazil case in the semi-arid actually shows that migration is higher after a drought shock. So people use migration as a coping strategy to deal with these adverse shocks. And the coefficient is around 3 to 6%, depends on the lagged year variable. We have some results with heterogeneity. It doesn't bring us a lot of information. For the sake of time, I will skip them. The most important effects we found is when we look by decades. So actually our results show that mostly of this out-migration response comes from the 70s and the 80s. Actually don't found evidence for a response from the 90s to the 2010 in the two specifications. So we have results that show that people migrate because of this drought shock, but this is coming from earlier in our samples, so in the 70s and the 80s. And so given these results, we try to question if it's coming from actually the droughts having an impact on agriculture production only at the beginning of the sample, but this is not what we found. We found that the shock is still relevant until today, is still negative and very significant. So it's not an answer that the drought does not affect the economy nowadays, but is an answer that nowadays this shock's not leading to migration, and we try to ask ourselves why. So we moving on briefly to the mechanism to try to answer this question of why this out-migration response is less pronounced in the semi-arid Brazil. The first mechanism is the rural social security. It was created in the 70s, but it was expanded greatly in the 90s after the constitution. And actually before the 1991, it was only for head of households and half of minimum wage. After 91, it was the rural social security was a transfer for males and females, and also to now 100% of the minimum wage. Our estimates we control for the annual rural population share, and our dependence variable is only the migration rates of the young. It's important to know that we are using this eligible share of each municipality to receive the rural social security as a proxy to actually receiving the rural social security. And we also did some exercises showing that this works as a good proxy. And here, just to show this measure, we can see that it expanded greatly in the 90s, so it comes from around 2% to around 60% of eligible share for rural security in average for each municipality, and also the density was located significantly to the right. And our results of interaction results is actually that we found some minor evidence that municipalities that have a higher eligible share to receive this rural social security actually are migrating less because of after we have this drought shocks. If you look at our last specification, the results comes mainly when we have extreme drought events. So we don't find significance, statistical significance when we have a regular drought event. And moving on to the last mechanism, we try to use the number of bank branches per capita as a way to try to measure credit availability of these municipalities. It's important to know that these municipalities, it has a huge mass around zero, so most municipalities do not have any bank branches in our periods of analysis. And actually what we found is that this is not significant, these interactions. So using number of bank branches per capita, actually we don't find that municipalities that have a higher number of bank branches migrate more or less because of after we have this drought event. So this is our main results. And to conclude, migration sees as a coping strategy when we have a local adverse shocks. Semi-arid Brazil is appropriate setting to try to study this relationship. Our result is that migration is a response to drought shocks in Brazil, but our results come mainly from the 70s and the 80s with no impacts in recent years. Our mechanisms analysis points to a scenario where more inequality that comes from rural social security decrease this out-migration response. And since this transfer was expanded greatly in the 90s, we can feel that it can explain partly the decrease of out-migration. We conjecture as well that other significant liquidity transfers from the government, such as Bolsa Família and PET, that's Programa of Erradicação do Trabalho Infantil, can also be another source of significant liquidity that can influence this response. So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand. I see here Henrique.
Hey, Roberta, how are you? So first of all, wonderful presentation. The second thing that I would like to ask you is about your analysis of the rural social security, because one thing that you may be looking at is that you're looking at the whole out-migration, but we know that young people are not affected by rural social security. So if you think that social security is one of those things that are making people stay at home, maybe for young migrants, there should be still an effect. So my question basically is, do you see an effect on young migrants for the 2000s and the 1990s, or that's not the case? And maybe a recommendation for later work, later development of your work, is to look at the impact for specific types of migrants, and especially if they are eligible for other social programs, such as Bolsa Família. That's it.
Okay, so actually when I do this mechanisms analysis of the rural social security, I only look at the migration rates per the young population. So it's only migration rates of the young that I'm looking at. So it has an impact. My main interpretation is that, for example, okay, it's not the person that receives the rural social security because only the old receives, but it can be a member of the family, or it can increase overall the liquidity of the municipality. So it's not essentially the person that receives that's not migrating because of these transfers, but it can also be second order indirect effects of an increased liquidity in this municipality because of the rural social security. So actually our result is only on the migration of the young, not the old. And related to your second question, yes, I think that actually Bolsa Familia, it's pretty relevant to and I think I conjecture that has an impact. And I'm also trying to work with this microdata to see if I can find some evidence of that.
Hi, Roberta. I would have a question. I don't know if you have looked at this, but if you say the out of migration is not there anymore in the recent years, could you see if there is the migration is coming back, if these people are coming back to Northeast?
I cannot identify this individual, but I can try to see, at least for a descriptive analysis, to see this return to the semi-arid migration. The census also questions the people if they lived before in the Southeast and now they live again in the Northeast. So I can try to see if these flows are relevant. Yes. But this is not the main purpose of the paper. The main purpose of the paper is try to see out migration from the Northeast because of drought shocks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Henrique, your hand is still raised. I don't know if you have another question or.
Yes, I have another question. So, have you checked the other climatic shocks to see if it's only drought that is relevant? And maybe one thing that you should look at is temperature, and if temperature is relevant even in the 1990s and in the 2000s, because one thing that may be happening is that while aridity is not a problem anymore in terms of economic security, temperature may have different effects. Because one thing that I'm thinking about is that, especially in the 1990s and the 2000s, the government was really concerned about water scarcity. So there has been a lot of expansion of water reservoirs programs and things like that. So have you tried to look at temperature as well, or maybe you are not that concerned because agricultural output has been affected still?
Yeah, so actually, in the sake of time, I cannot show the model very carefully, but actually we control for temperature in all of our results. So we do that. This is something that is done in the literature as well, because we are trying to see only the effect of drought. So I control to temperature to not give margin to interpretation of higher temperatures and not water scarcity. So actually we control for temperature because of that. And yeah, that's mainly the analysis that we do and in relation to temperature. And also the second question, I think it was related to some projects. Yeah, we still find that the drought has a negative and very significant impact on economy into recent years. So we don't find any evidence of a local adaptivity capacity to deal with shocks at least in this same area.
Thank you.
So, Bruno?
Okay. So yeah, just if you have some few minutes left, and so I can maintain the average of one question about clustering per session. One thing that is common in this kind of regressions that uses rainfall is that they have lots of spatial correlation. And when you cluster at the region level, you do not take that into account. So I actually sent Gustavo a reference on that. There are some different ways to do inference in this setting, like doing some randomization using historical data on rainfall. So just something that you might want to do as a robustness.
Okay, thank you. Our regressions are clusterized at the municipality level, but yes, we can think about more other specifications that try to account for other spatial cross-sections correlation as well. So thank you. If anyone else has a question. Okay, so thank you very much for everyone that has attended our main session today. If anyone else has further comments or questions to the three of us, you can email us and get in contact with us and our collectors. Thank you very much for your presence, and see you in the conference.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Tchau.
Tchau, tchau. Boa apresentação, adorei.
Valeu, obrigada. Você
Tchau,
também.
Gente, muito obrigado, tá? Vou estar encerrando aqui.
Tá.
Bom? Então, vocês vão se desconectar. E daqui a meia hora, não sei se vocês vão estar na próxima, 10h30, a gente retorna, tá bom?
Tá bom, obrigada. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau.